Hey, everybody. It's another Blowback bonus episode here in season 3. Thanks for joining us once again. In this episode, Noah is going to interview lecturer of history at Yale University, Michael Brenes. And they're going to talk about the formation of something we still live with today, the national security state, the military-industrial complex, whatever you want to call it. It really began to mutate into a recognizable size and shape during the Cold War and the events that we cover this season. So they're going to talk about the economic makeup of that, the political makeup of that, and make sense of how this thing came to be and how it persists and still operates today. So enjoy this bonus episode with Michael Brenes.
The way that I came to know your work, Michael, was through your book published in 2020 for Might and Right.
Mm-hmm.
I think that your book is a really exciting and accessible sort of starting point to understanding the development of, what people call the military industrial complex for shorthand. Could you talk a little bit about how you came to write this book? What was the research that led to it?
Sure. No, thanks. Well, thanks for having me, Noah. This is really cool for me as a longtime listener of Blowback and a big fan. So yeah, I came to write the book. Well, the book started out as my dissertation. I went to get a PhD at the CUNY Graduate Center in 2007. I entered graduate school, and by the time I started thinking about a dissertation, there had been a bunch of scholarship on the rise of the right. Or conservatism in the U.S. And a lot of this scholarship on the rise of the right kind of told this teleological story of the right, first, I think, starting out in like the John Birch Society and then coalescing in Barry Goldwater's campaign in 1964, and then through the 1970s, basically challenging the Democratic Party in various ways, and then triumphing in 1980 with Ronald Reagan being elected in 1980. And kind of the story stopped there. And then alongside that narrative, where there was a narrative about why conservatives became conservative. And the idea was that conservatives became conservative because of the ways in which they are dependent upon like militarism and the military industrial complex. And this was actually in one major book by Lisa McGurr.
Suburban Warriors.
Suburban Warriors. Yeah,
right.
That was the major book, and I read this book at the time. And I'm like, oh, this is an interesting book. But that was kind of the story as it stopped. Like right there was that conservatives are conservatives because they're militarists, or they're dependent upon the defense industry for jobs, and therefore they're conservative, and therefore they're anti-communist. But that story I found was incomplete, and I found it was incomplete because there's a whole there was a lack of understanding of the military industrial complex. Not many historians have been writing about it at this point. Like it was not really there's only a few historians who work on this. When I discovered this in graduate school, like Alex Rowland, who wrote this book on the military industrial complex, and there was a couple others.
Right. It's in researching this season of Blowback, a lot of the books that I've drawn from for, telling the story of the time, in addition to your book, are a lot of books that are from the time, like The Warfare State by Fred Cook. When people who are covering this as journalists contemporaneously, and, I've been working through newspaper archives kind of myself, this narrative that you kind of set out to at least respond to, if not dismiss entirely, about the rise of the radical right in the 1960s, following the earlier link in the historical chain in the 1950s, obviously, and even earlier in the 1940s, you see, it's Eisenhower coins the phrase, or at least in the popular imagination, in 1950. 59 or 60 as he's leaving office.
61, yeah.
61, sorry, yes, as he's leaving office. And so he, coined, this description. So in those 20 years, I guess, there had been this wartime mobilization that bookends the front of it for World War II. And then it seems like, where your book kind of picks up the story and makes a really interesting and, sort of comprehensive historical argument is about how in that fight over what the transition from a wartime mobilization to a domestic economy would look like, you saw the construction of this thing that we all now know and love, the military industrial complex.
Yeah.
What was, let's just, I guess, start, at the beginning of that process. In the 1940s, in this debate over, the war, like how the wartime mobilization would look in peacetime, in the middle of World War II, many Americans, knew or understood that they were, or felt, correctly, that they were going to win the war. And, so these debates were ongoing even as they were fighting the war. Starting at that moment, what was the frame of the debate? Like, what were the sides and what was exactly being contested that led to the construction of this thing in the period after the war immediately?
Well, I mean, there was first obviously a universal consensus that communism is a threat, or the Soviet Union is a threat, but communism broadly is a threat. And so after 1946, after George Kennan's long telegram where he says the Soviet Union essentially is an imperialist power, and then the analogy of World War II and Hitler standing in for Stalin, there's a consensus within the political establishment, within Congress, within the presidency, that the United States needs to do something to fight communism and to prevent another world war. That's the assumption. That's the ideological assumption. The debate, though, in Congress is how this fight is going to materialize in terms of institutions and in policies that would shape the political economy of the United States. So on one hand, you actually have Democrats who are the loudest voices for a warfare state, or something that would be akin to a warfare state. They argue for the expansion of the defense budget. They think that many of them are quite anti-communist. They are quite vocal in their anti-communism. They are doing that for many reasons, because they believe in it, but also because they are facing Republicans who charge them with being socialists.
Right. And I mean, why, these were people who were part of the New Deal coalition, from FDR to Truman, how did the, this kind of negotiation over the warfare state change? Like, FDR was seen as a person, he was this, personality unto himself with who is the character of his administration, whereas Truman was the only senator who people had any respect for during that, the Depression era Congress, which is, because of his investigations into the military budget and spending excesses and so on. So, we go from the personality like FDR, guy with an agenda, man with a plan, and then he dies, leaves that in suspension. And this, bureaucrat haberdasher from the Midwest takes up that mantle. What changes there in terms of like how this debate gets negotiated, and sort of what was FDR's position, and what maybe was he advancing or keeping in check, and what, then changed with Truman and the rise of Atchison's foreign policy, I guess.
Yeah, I think, well, one is just Harry Truman being Harry Truman. So Harry Truman is insecure in terms of his position as president. He kind of views himself as an accidental president, like Lyndon Johnson would in 1963, right? So he wasn't supposed to be president, but FDR dies in April of 1945 of a brain hemorrhage in Warm Springs, Georgia, and then he's thrust into the presidency. And he has no real foreign policy experience. FDR has kept him out of many foreign policy negotiations. He's only been his vice president at this point, for about several months, and he doesn't even know about the atomic bomb. And so when he becomes president, there's an immediate, as you would imagine, interest in burnishing or brandishing his Cold War credentials or his foreign policy credentials. And so he becomes this hawkish figure who, in meetings with Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, is saying, take care of your business in Poland, being very aggressive and belligerent. And showing off how arrogant he is about these types of issues. Maybe arrogant's not the word, but certainly bellicose, right? So one is just Harry Truman and just his personality and his insecurities. The second is the fact that the Democrats are, at this point, because of the war and because of Republicans in Congress who take over Congress in 1947, they're on the defensive in terms of a domestic policy that would be interested in or able to expand the welfare state in the United States that was done so in the New Deal. So in the New Deal, you got Social Security, you've got unemployment programs, you've got a lot of public works programs. Those go away, obviously, with the war, creating ending unemployment. Truman actually wants to create a universal health care program. He opposes Taft-Hartley in 1947. He supports a full employment bill in 1946. But the Republicans in Congress don't let him do that because they control Congress, and the Democrats are therefore on the defensive. And so they say, well, if we can't get what we want on the domestic side, well, maybe we can try to channel growth through military spending. And this is where you get what's called military Keynesianism. And that starts to take shape during the 1940s. And the Korean War is really the sort of apotheosis.
Right. Well, and there's also, I think, to my mind, much historically neglected, speech that Truman gives where he outlines the Truman Doctrine.
Yeah.
And that comes in the late 1940s. And to my mind, what it really sort of calcifies, and part of what I think it sort of speaks to is how much Truman and the Democrats' position on Cold War issues was one of, yes, belligerence, but also, sort of fundamentally about compromise. It was about identifying a way to fight the Cold, sort of from the get-go, as the Cold War was itself being birthed, developing a way of, sort of like a middle path of trying to fight it. Because of the absence of any, success. I mean, in part, just, the vacuum of success, any success domestically meant that this is what they were up to in terms of where they could actually advance their interests. You see this literally, in the work of Andrew Elrod has shown this, in terms of how the Defense Production Act was utilized, the wartime mobilization at the very beginning of Korea, as inflation is happening and prices are going up, things that had been elements of Truman's so-called fair deal were folded and used, like they were baked into what was the Korean War mobilization. So, before we get to, thinking about, I guess then, like June 1950 and what the sort of like decision tree is as far, what is the sort of crossroads at which America's warfare state is at. Like, what's on the table for them at the moment that hostilities in Korea escalate and the North goes south over the 38th parallel.
Well, I mean, in Congress, there's a debate over, should we fund the Air Force or should we have a broader warfare state that would be enabling the United States to build up its ground forces, to arm, and this, I should preface this by saying in 1947, there's not only the Truman Doctrine, but there's the passage of the National Security Act in 1947 that creates a host of institutions like the National Security Council, which will then lead, National Security Act will then lead to, by 1949, the development of the Department of Defense, the creation of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff. There's an assumption by Democrats like Truman, but also in Congress, Democrats in Congress, who are becoming, as you said, now Cold War Democrats after being New Deal Democrats, that the president needs more information, more institutions, more people to support this broader mission that the United States is going to undertake in the post-war world, which is preventing communism from becoming global and to protect, obviously, quote unquote, the forces of freedom and security. And so this is the assumption. So these institutions get created in 47. In 1948, there's the Marshall Plan. There's Truman Doctrine, which allocates monies to Turkey and Greece to prevent these states from going communism. And the Marshall Plan happens in 48. And this is really where you start to see this I would argue, this larger debate over what is going to be our defense establishment. And the Republicans in Congress, actually, they're dominated by these hawkish, sort of fiscal hawks, who believe that if we just have a larger Air Force, we could take care of our defense interests.
Right. This is the sort of like proto idea behind the new look when Eisenhower's administration assumes power in 53, that you can, and if people are looking for a more recent example of this, what is really just a kind of like bureaucratic management dynamic, I guess, Rumsfeld making the same arguments in the early 2000s again, from a conservative vantage point.
This is always attractive for like fiscal Republicans is making the military more efficient through air power.
Well, so this is okay. Yeah. And this is where I think your book really, really shines because this has effects downstream that are really, really meaningful in terms of the, it's, I think something, what like to phrase it, like economists today that are wrestling with the issues of inflation, right? They might frame it as like, what are these, I guess like, how is the supply side? What is the character of the supply side of the economy? How is it shaped? Our industrial capacity, the ability of our economy to make things and to organize resources to, generate goods that are not just services or, financial products. What is the effect that like orienting so much of, what is the how significant is the American orientation toward a war economy in this period? And two, how do you, I guess, what is the effect that it has? Like, what is the effect that it has on social inequality versus, when you manufacture when you make swords instead of plowshares, to borrow the words of Isaiah.
Right. So, I mean, yeah. So the first point on industrial policy, I would say that the United States has no industrial policy. It doesn't have an industrial policy today. It didn't really have one in the 1950s, 40s. The defense industry becomes a way in which you can handle industrial policy. And therefore, when you have an industrial policy that's based on defense, one, the federal government is kind of, in many ways, dictating how manufacturing is. I mean, obviously, how manufacturing occurs in the United States. The sites of defense plants are the sites of as you get further into the Cold War, sites where the United States believes that these are areas of interest in national security. So you get the defense industry moving out of the Northeast and the Midwest. So the three states that received the most defense contracts in 1950 were New York, California, and who's the other one? New York, California, and Michigan. Sorry. And then by 1958, it's California's number one, then New York, and then it's Texas. And then you also see Kansas appearing on that list.
Right. And I think part of the argument and part of the idea there, what you're describing is that, why are these companies moving there? It's because the wages are lower and the tax position is more the regulatory situation is much more advantageous, right?
Right. There's it's cheap land, it's cheap labor. And so you start seeing, because of Korea too, which we can get into, the federal government incentivizing defense production outside of major Northeast and Midwest industrial centers like Detroit, places like that, and going into the South and Southwest and facilitating, therefore, inequality in ways that you see today, which is that the defense industry is predominantly reliant upon, after Korea, highly skilled white collar labor that is going to be producing weapons or the information for weapons through research and development. There's not a big manufacturing base needed for ICBMs.
And and this is, in addition to becoming more white collar, it's also worth identifying that, on two levels, there are defense industry. I would argue that on two levels. One, these companies that hire, in addition to like the sort of general right-wing politics of arms manufacturers, part of what you're describing, I think, in terms of like the nature of the employment, in one part, there is, a lot of these companies are rife with fraud. And they work on projects that never come to fruition or are really ineffective. There are tons of scandals and a lot of cronyism, and then simultaneously, it's also, I think, from and that's sort of on the level of how these individual defense contractors are operate and represent themselves across the country. But then in Washington, you also have like an aggressive sort of, it's a very big trough. And the amount of pork and the amount of money that gets lost in the Pentagon from Washington is fairly infamous. And to me, what's kind of interesting, I guess, there is that it's like this is not an industry like this is it's shaping what America's remaining manufacturing capacity looks like, because even in the 50s we're beginning to wind down our investment in manufacturing capacity, and so as we're putting that labor overseas, moving it elsewhere, investing in these kinds of things, it's also, these businesses are themselves, like as a category, much more susceptible, to what you might call risk or strategic mismanagement. Go look no further, I would argue today, for a present example, than Boeing, which is, the people, it's not going to for Blowback listeners, Boeing will not fail. It will not go into bankruptcy. It will not be that's a false conversation. However, it is obviously in financially horrible straits, and there's been a lot of huge disasters there, including safety issues. And it's because the structure of these businesses is not, for whatever reason, but it seems historically evident, that they do not lend themselves to some sort of stable management. They're rife with corruption and sort of failure. Looking at the period of the 40s, I guess, after my extended divergent rant about this, but I guess I'm kind of curious if there are any examples that spring to mind about these sorts of incidents, or how that sort of the self-dealing, or how that kind of angle is a part of this at that time.
Well, so the biggest example, I think, is actually after the 40s into the 70s. So 1971 with Lockheed, when Lockheed almost goes bankrupt for overspending on this plane called the C-5A plane, which has the wingspan of the size of the football field. And they just keep putting in more and more money into it. And there are consistent cost overruns. And as you said, the federal government is just allocating money for this, but Lockheed keeps spinning a story like, oh, it's going to keep happening. And by 1971, they're on the verge of bankruptcy, and they go to Congress asking for several $100 million in loan guarantees to bail them out, which Congress does in 71. So this sets a precedent for too big to fail. Well before, I think, 75 and New York City's like those types of big bailouts. But this is kind of baked into the cake, as you're saying. So, for instance, like Charles Wilson, who is the president of General Electric, he in 1942 is a member of the War Production Board under FDR. So he's overseeing defense production through the War Production Board and plans. By 1950, he is back now in the Truman administration as head of the Office of Defense Mobilization, where he spent within the interregnum between War Production Board and the ODM. He goes back to General Electric and makes his name as a union busting, which is General Electric is well known for union busting, president, and then takes over in ODM and kind of runs it in a way that solidifies these kind of what parastatus or private public connections between the military and industry.
Right. Like
and then overseas.
The most famous example of which being like the Defense Policy Board as sort of the legacy of those.
Right.
And, to go back just even a little bit further, I guess, we go back a bit further in time, the Service of Supply in the Army, or I believe that was the name of the unit. And you talk about this in your book as well. Like, it is there were these really, aggressive, and I've researched a bunch of this myself as well. Looking at the National Association of Manufacturers at the time, they were openly lobbying with the Army for Congress to spend money on like this. The Army was fully politicized in a way that I think a lot of people now would be kind of pretty loath to believe.
Yes. And then you have congressional officials coming and speaking before the National Association of Manufacturers saying, I want to give you more money, but like the left is not like in the 60s, for instance, with Vietnam, like the left is criticizing military industrial complex. We all know how much we hate the left. And so I want to do more, but I can't. this really gets, this private public connection gets solidified, I think, in the war, where private individuals from defense companies are brought in to help the government's war policy, and those people come back in this ever revolving door in 1950s, and they come back again, right? Where you see people within industry or within the military go into industry who come back into government. And so this is the early Cold War period, really World War II, kind of sets a precedent for this today. But the too big to fail notion, once you start getting defense companies suffering in the late 50s, after you see a recession in the early 60s, and they're asking for more money, that's when you start to see this narrative of, we're too big to fail. Yes, we have national security implications if we fail, but also we have a bunch of workers who now depend upon us, and we can't fail on their behalf too. So labor gets sort of part of the justification for the keeping of these companies that really, obviously, as many companies do, enrich the top as opposed to spreading the wealth at the bottom.
Well, and it's paired, to sort of hammer home your earlier point about military Keynesianism. In the 1950s, the chair of the House Armed Services Committee, when the Congress is controlled by Democrats, is Lyndon Johnson, who, as he rises to power, in Texas, part of his power base is General Dynamics, the arms contractor that is a huge employer there, and there is a way in which it's, these, because of both the nature of these jobs, manufacturing, stable middle class income, often unionized, and also the national strategic importance, that's given, the extra political weight that these industries have. You can sort of see in real time, as you're describing it, like the way in which the, sort of modern political coalitions that are able to pass things like the Great Society or culminate in, the rise of the new right with Reagan, are oriented on, they're sort of the landscape that the meta political landscape they're operating with is in very large part shaped by these very specific companies and forces.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think that just becomes even more paramount as you get the 1950s becoming, and despite, like, Eisenhower makes that speech in 61, but he's the president who's most responsible for the institutionalization of the spread of the military industrial complex across the country. It's into, like, what Anne Marcuse has called a gun belt, right? It starts in the north and goes to the south and into the west. It's like a gun belt. And then it's become too big. Like, Eisenhower's warning us. He's the tragedy was tragic, but it is a tragedy. But Eisenhower's warning us in 1961 that this is too big to fail. That there are these connections between what he calls the military industrial, and he wanted to call it congressional complex, but congressional got taken out. But by this point, it's already controlling, as you said, it's already controlling industrial policy, and to a certain extent, it's an institution that we rely upon for jobs, for economic growth. It's already an ideological weapon that is used by people on the right, but also the left, to pillory anyone who thinks that we should spend more on social welfare. And this is, something that we have, I think, to grapple with as we think about, like, the institution of the military industrial complex just not being an institution, not being a military or material product or feature of us, but like how it served ideological purposes as well.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of the 1950s, there had been, for example, the surge in prices, and it's inflation is all, at the time of this interview, as I'm sure for the rest of this year, inflation, big word in the environment today, and the way that it was partly dealt with there. Truman created this whole bureaucracy, had an office of price stabilization as well as wage stabilization. Like, they saw it from their angle to tackle it from their perspective, that they were attacking it at both ends with a lot of focus. And then with the wartime mobilization, like Truman, in 52, he attempts to seize the steel industry. And you have in general this, very aggressive effort, when we talk about the war over inflation, it's, I guess, to tease it out a little bit, I think we're really talking about the war over the consumer price, which is the, end cost that is passed to the consumer of a whole lot of different, factors and costs, raw materials, labor, et cetera. And when capital feels that the cost is getting too high for the consumer because the cost of labor, the other thing, like they've got to they need to reduce labor. I mean, their answer, the capital's answer, is to obviously reduce labor share if we want to characterize it in sort of the most familiar, at least to me, familiar terms. Right. But it seems, I guess, that like the way in which they did it in the Korean War specifically, what were some of those investments, like the way in which they decided to fix prices or attempted to fix prices? How did they mechanically want to control prices while putting on a war footing and using that, as ways to, get people jobs or maintain steady employment, et cetera, and not just make a government policy that was geared toward, maximizing returns for the rich?
Well, I mean, what Truman wants to do, again, this makes sense. Truman wants to create kind of like a war production board, Office of Price Administration, which is these institutions are created during World War II to control prices and to facilitate defense production. He wants to do that, and he thinks like we can do that now in 1950. And again, the National Security Act is supposed to do that. Creates this thing called the National Security Resources Board, which was supposed to be done for this, like used for this purpose.
And Truman, I was actually going to ask you about that because Truman puts one of his closest advisors, Stuart Symington, to be the chief of it, and then Symington later goes on to be a senator from Missouri, and he is he also authors this one memo in the Korean War that I find fascinating. Do you know about NSC 100?
No. Well,
I mean, no. This doesn't necessarily have to be for the interview, because I'm also just curious about this. Basically, Symington writes this memo that Truman dismisses it on the record, but it's just like, if you read it, it like kind of lays out what happens. Like it's fairly prescient, and like, and this is after the NSRB has like lost the bureaucrat, like the papers, like the newspaper stories I read show that like by the time this is happening, like I guess this would be January 51. Because I believe this is when Truman is, this is January 51, because Truman is like weighing what the fuck he's going to be doing. He's doing with MacArthur. And that's, but yeah, there's a really, I'm kind of curious, but that was a long-winded way of saying that like the NSRB drew my attention because Truman puts one of his closest, one of his most important political advisors there. And, what do they do and to what extent are they successful at it? Because these institutions don't last forever or very long at all.
No, I mean, well, an SRB, the National Security Resources Board, doesn't last very long. It doesn't really do anything. It's kind of defunct until, like, the Office of Defense Mobilization takes over its responsibilities once the Korean War breaks out in September of 1950, or the landing in Incheon in 1950. Then, so the Office of Defense Mobilization is created in December of 1950, and that's headed by Charles Wilson, who we discussed. And that is a way to, very interesting, I think, displace people like Symington, displace these sort of with intergovernmental networks, and make defense production, make defense coordination public and private. And what the ODM does, as you already said, is very key in the 52 steel strike, where it sets steel prices, because the idea is we're going to have rationing, and we're going to make sure that people steel is available for the war. I mean, the ODM also encourages defense production, as I said, out of the Northeast. It leads to the creation of defense plants in the South and Southwest. And the idea is, I think, the fact that Charles Wilson is heading this, who again is anti-labor, the idea is to make sure that labor doesn't have the power to ask for more, to do what it wants to do with taking advantage of the war to ask for more money, which is what leads to the strike, because prices are kept low. And one of the demands of the steelworkers is to increase prices, because they know that if there's inflation, then it's going to lead to higher wages and things like that. And so it's a way to kind of control who makes money out of the war. I mean, to put it quite bluntly, I mean, this is what General Electric develops plants in California during the war, and it's a way to make sure that they're benefiting from this too, as Wilson is overseeing how industry responds to labor at this point.
Right. And there's something very interesting there too, I think, about the, like, you know, what that says about, you know, 1952 and 1953 are very interesting years then, because, you know, even though the front in Korea does not really change, like by this point, it is settled into a stalemate. And however, armistice is not signed until the middle of 1953. So, you know, what is the, you know, this over that time, you know, while the front isn't, you know, changing, there is, however, this gigantic, as you're describing it, like kind of, you know, domestic political negotiation over who gets what share of the war pie.
Right.
And ultimately that war pie, you know, is going to get even smaller because, as you previously apprised me, you know, GDP or 17% of government spending of outlays were on defense during the period of the Korean War. And that's going to shrink dramatically, like by half over the next few years. And that was something that had been foreseeable since the early 40s, that sort of, you know, I wouldn't quite call it a gravy train, but just that like that economic restructuring would be inevitable. And so, you know, how is like, you know, why is this moment 52 to 53 so critical for that? You know, what is, you know, especially with the steel strike, like how is that negotiation being played out? And what does the armistice end up sort of, you know, signaling or mark, you know, even if it's just sort of chronologically about how that process is evolving? Because to me, they feel very related, even if I can't put my finger on it directly.
No, you're right. I mean, so on a very basic level, I mean, defense expenditures go from, I think it's 11 billion in the years after the war, so 46, 47, to about 50 billion by 53. So you have more than that's more than triple defense expenditures, the defense budget in less than 10 years. So in that sense, it creates a precedent for a permanent overarching need for defense on a wide level. So that's on sort of basic level. So by 53, that's already done. That's already solidified in the minds of policymakers that we need this big defense budget.
Like the intellectual project of getting the American public to accept even, you know, another, like in a level of defense spending than they would otherwise get, that they otherwise might. Had been kind of established because the Korean War, you know, further entrenched those contractors. One of the things, the specific issues, and I talk about this a bit in the show, the name for this debate given in the 40s, but it kind of dies out by the 50s, is reconversion.
Yes.
You know, could you talk a little bit about what is reconversion and how did that, you know, like how was that debate? What was that political debate? And how is it settled? How did it go gently into the night?
Well, I mean, I don't think it did. I think that's the thing. I mean, the debate over reconversion is, again, what Korea does for me, and I write this in the book, what Korea does for me is bring back fresh memories of World War II, where the war basically ended unemployment. It created jobs. Korea doesn't do that, but it creates jobs through defense spending, with the hope that Americans can get better jobs through defense, or if not, it will give them opportunities that they can escape, from which they can escape their current economic condition. And everybody wants a piece of this pie. It doesn't matter if you're Democrat or if you're a Republican or if you're a liberal or conservative, everybody wants a portion of the pie. So what I see in the efforts to reconvert America's industrial policy to a World War II type footing, not a total war, but getting close to it, is just a reinvigoration of the idea that defense will come save us again. Like defense, like World War II, obviously in a very elementary level, ends. Everyone knows this, ends the Great Depression because we have 17% unemployment by 39, hovering around 17%. The unemployment is done. The demobilization after the war concerns many policymakers who feel that there's going to be a recession. There is, or if not, a depression. And they don't have an industrial policy. There isn't a sense of like how we're going to get us back to like a World War II type economy. Korea gives an indication of how that can happen. So when you have the Office of Defense Mobilization, when you have these efforts by like Defense Manpower Policy Number 4, which is very straightforwardly a policy issued by Truman in 51 that says the Defense Department is going to allocate defense contracts to economically depressed districts. So this is not like World War II, where the defense production for defense happens in cities and people go to find these jobs in industrial centers. Now the federal government's main mission, not main mission, but one of its big missions is to bring defense to areas that need economic relief or economic stimulus of some kind.
So the premise is that like we are going to be spending money on defense and the competition is for the carrots or what have you. Like,
right.
That's a very helpful reframing, in who are the losers in this case? We know who the winners are, obviously the losers politically are the peace camp. And
Sure.
We've tried to talk a bit about, there will have been some of that in the season, but during Korea, like who are the people that are making, obviously like the Wallaceites and the Progressive Party are sort of the political contingent that tries to represent this. So when I say the peace camp, that's kind of who I mean, but they're snuffed out in the 48 midterms pretty soundly. Like that's the end of that.
Yep.
But in terms of the material losers from this bargain and this restructuring, and you sort of like the rise, the prefiguration of what you call the gun belt, or Ann Marcuson calls the gun belt.
Right.
Who are the losers?
Predominantly unskilled or low skilled Black labor who got jobs under in the defense plants in World War II, and who are brought back into, or there are more jobs created as you start to see defense plants, basically the same defense plants opening back up during Korea. And there's a demand for unskilled or low skilled labor that can be provided just because of historical circumstances, inequality, racial inequality, and economic inequality, that Blacks, there's a demand for labor. And so Blacks can fill that demand. And the defense industry is historically segregated or discriminates against racial minorities. So on one level, it's like the unskilled workers who during World War II got good jobs through the defense industry, were able to earn a living for a while that could be seen as a means of social uplift or social mobility. During Korea, those people lose after the war, because now we're shifting to high tech research and development based defense industry, which is not going to require a lot of unskilled labor. And I would say in the long run, the biggest loser are the labor unions themselves. Like as you start to see labor being more under the gun in the 60s and 70s, the steel strike in 52, I mean, the steelworkers do get, I believe, like a 16% or 16 cent wage increase in their pay. But the problem is labor is always on the defensive, I would say, in the defense industry, certainly in the 70s when things get worse economically. And this leads to a disaffection politically amongst defense workers, where I don't like this, but the idea of Reagan Democrats, like people who are Democrats who vote for Republican Party, like that's not the real phenomenon, but people who are labor, who belong to a labor union or belong to the International Association of Manufacturers, or machinists, sorry, on the IAM, which is part of the AFL-CIO. These are skilled workers within the defense industry. Many of them are Democrats or vote for Democrats. They start to become more politically apathetic, and labor unions also therefore aren't a vehicle at this point by the 60s and 70s for the Democratic Party in the ways they
right. I think another way to describe part of what you're describing is also like the politics of suburbanization in general.
That's it too. Yeah.
And sort of the and this goes to something else that's, another interest of mine, which is the way in which, defense is paired with, redevelopment, but also just regional development, period.
Yeah.
The interstates are constructed through like a defense frame and appropriation. The idea of Cold War mobilization and how are we going to be able to protect our cities and so on, and that's how we build we build the highways, and then at the same time, I guess there is this take for example Richard Nixon. in this season.
Right.
He is somebody who, his earliest, when he was elected to Congress, when he was elected to the Senate, there's a very young senator who quickly got elevated himself from the House of Representatives to the Senate. Who were the people that kick into the slush fund for which he had organized then? It's a mix of defense contract employees and financial executives, mainly, including SNL executives. So there's a way in which, I think like somebody like Richard Nixon, who's often thought of, and correctly, as sort of like an independent political force and, representing his own interest within the Republican Party, his constituency, when he got his start, his base of power, this is a guy from Orange County. Where did his voters work? So to your point, like, yeah, a bunch of them, did vote Democrat, sure, but a lot of them, were, I think, when we think about like where did the silent majority go to work, a bunch of them did it at like McDonnell Douglas or Hughes Aircraft, in Richard Nixon's districts,
right, and then they like the politics of those workers evolve over time. That's kind of one of the points that I want to make, is that the problem with like Lisa McGurr's, like when I first started this book, was that the people in her book are very like one dimensional. Like, they don't change over time and they don't seem to evolve. Whereas the people in my book might start out voting for Democrats, but as the defense industry starts rewarding a larger portion of white working class voters, white collar upper class voters, and does so in ways that create obviously further inequality in the United States. It doesn't create it doesn't create a left politics. It doesn't create an anti-status or an anti-conservative politics. It creates like this sort of sense of, how do I get back what I had before? Sort of like a nostalgia for the past, or a sense of like who is to blame, and that's the federal government. The federal government's to blame, and then
right.
People are all in this together. But like,
to me, the Matt Christman, friend of the pod, has made the point to me before, to me and Brennan, I think, about how, and we go into this in our show, like the way MacArthur ends up, like his, he fails to realize his potential destiny as a right-wing, political figure, a national figure. In 1951, when it's his greatest opportunity to do so, he flames out.
Right.
But among a lot of his base and the hardcore supporters who were pushing him, including one Herbert Hoover, who was among the first people to speak to MacArthur after he was fired by Truman, and who had by this point become a Dulles-like Christian internationalist right-wing hawk, anti-communist zealot, real Romanov vibes with him, in my opinion. So you have MacArthur there, and then so MacArthur being displaced by, Eisenhower, who, is, in my opinion, who was pretty right-wing himself, but was, did not, is just cut from a somewhat different mold, is not quite even as moderate as like a George Marshall type general, but is more of a kind of, just somebody who I think sees MacArthur, he worked for MacArthur and just thought of him as like, yeah, it's a self-destructive motherfucker. And he wasn't wrong, but a lot of the right-wing audience, those Hoovers, when we think about like, well, why is everything wrong? To me, some of like the Christman has pointed this out, just that like the idea that like Eisenhower, fucked MacArthur and stole a 52 primary and, pulled the rug out, and that this was the development, this kind of, that they were forced to get like, like their compromise, their solace was having Nixon as vice president. It's just like this endless, like, that to your point about like, loss or whatever. I think that like that is where you could pinpoint as the pivot point when MacArthur is no longer like their first hero, the first daddy, the guy who gets millions of people in the streets of New York City. Never before have there been crowds like that. 250,000 greeting him when he arrives in DC. Joint resolutions that like, this when a figure of that who they thought was, going to be their Caesar, their Hitler, whoever you want to call it, like, when that gets stolen, that's, perhaps the trauma that, is what bubbles up, like, the tar pits or whatever the fuck, a decade later.
Yeah. I mean, I would say
it's plausible to me.
there's some Democrats also who want MacArthur to run too because they don't like Adlai Stevenson. But that's another point, which is to say, I think, there's to me, what like studying the defense industry does is offer an insight into like a very elusive phenomenon about why people vote or why people make decisions that they do in political terms. And what I see in the defense industry is that it's a coalition of people who are invested in it for both material and ideological interests. And those interests align over one purpose often in local areas, which is how do I keep my job and how do I if you're like a worker, but also if you're a defense industry executive, like not just how do I keep my job, but like how do I keep the money flowing and how do I keep my profits? And in terms of politics, how that gets expressed, it gets expressed in universal terms, which is bring more defense contracts into my district or into this area. And so this then feeds militarism in ways that I think are interesting and inadvertent sometimes. But crosses this like left right, often how we discuss politics in the United States, this left right binary dualistic ways about why people vote and what motivates them to vote. And so therefore, if you look at the defense industry and look how people rally behind it, it kind of obscures the nature, like the very complex nature of politics in the United States and why people after the 50s see that numbers are going down in defense. People are in like the Northeast and Midwest aren't getting the same defense contracts that they were getting, but they still want the defense industry to come in because that's the way that they get employed, but they're not actually beholden to this industry. They just want the jobs, but there's not an alternative because, again, the United States doesn't have an industrial policy and it has no social welfare state to support Americans so they can conceive of something of a job outside of defense. And so
right.
it makes this. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, it's just, to your point, like, the like Lyndon Johnson's Great Society was paired with like the military spend up of Vietnam. And then, Nixon, he instituted price controls. Yes. But he also, Vietnamization, quote unquote, the process of trying to make it and wage the Vietnam War more from Vietnam was also a response to those same domestic pressures of what you're describing, right, of when the cost of that gets, too high. And that you can't, because these industries are, rife with corruption, rife with fraud, and also, are ends to themselves. Nuclear warheads do not yield dividends. They're not like it's, that's the thing about, like, I was going to ask, sort of a way to conclude this about, one of the things you study is also the history of investing in a very specific kind of capital stock. Planes have to get replaced. They have to be maintained. They have to be fueled, and warheads have to get manufactured and so on. And then when they're no longer useful, they have to be outmoded, and even that process is costly and so on. Yeah. What is, like, I've obviously framed it a certain kind of way, but like, how would you frame or how would you describe the process by which like defense spending accrues over time? Because it's also the place where we get things like DARPA net, producing some, the internet. It's also where, NASA is, functionally like all of the technology that is used, so much of the research that's my pointing out is just saying for civilian life does come from this, so by, enmeshing these kinds of critical elements of science and, research for better human lives, with, military technology, what has that produced? Like in aggregate, like what does the system look like? What are the trade-offs there?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, I've never been asked that question before. This is good. So, I'll very quickly, I'll just say there are debates about is the military industrial complex capitalist or is it not capitalist? Does it exist outside of a capitalist framework because it's dependent upon the state and it's not marketing, to a traditional consumer, right? It doesn't have a consumer base. I don't find. I put this line in my dissertation that it wasn't a capitalist enterprise, and I don't agree with that anymore. I think it's actually the defense industry is idealized capitalism for capitalists. It's an industry that has to compete for contracts, and it can't spend money in perpetuity ostensibly, even though it does. But when it does get those contracts, it's able to function in ways that lead to cost overruns with impunity, that has shareholders, but does answers to shareholders in ways that don't necessarily create negative outcomes for the industry, because it can depend upon, not always, but can depend upon a consistent supporter in the federal government. And it escapes like the ideological, as much as like there's been as the left has gone after the defense industry for decades, it escapes criticism from the broader public because of the ways it justifies its production. That makes sense. I don't know.
No, I mean, I think that like what you're describing to me, this idea of how the nature of it, part of, I guess, one of the beautiful things about primitive accumulation, which is, accumulation for its own sake, like the defense industry is very, very good at that. And part of it is because they are able to make these things that have an ideological project that, justifies not only the generation of, new products, and new projects and new contracts, so sustained revenue that way. But also, as you see the American economy gear toward, kind of monopoly capital and, requiring market share dominance. And, in this day and age, subscription revenue, which a lot of American consumers are now experiencing. But, that's how a lot of defense contractors work and get their money, where it's like they will sell tools or products to the government that then, even if the government wants to stop a contract, it will take, it's like you are locked in. It's like you're, it's like the government's cable provider functionally. And that kind of, to me, like that is that's a project. That's not yes, it's a set of markets. It's a set of government, it's government spending, but it's also a, kind of like a war, it's a whole world.
And then like there's been talk for decades of getting the defense industry to diversify, to like go more into commercial markets, or now to allocate resources towards climate change or green jobs. But there's no incentive to do that. Like, why would you? There's no market incentive. Like the federal government is not doing that work. And so the response by the defense industry is to just merge and create bigger companies, because then they can create a bigger, can dominate a larger share of the defense pie, which is what happened in the 90s after the Cold War.
Michael, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a blast.
No, thanks for having me, Noah. It's been a lot of pleasure.